Okay, so welcome to another one of our Newcastle Youth Studies Centre's online seminar series. To begin with, I'd like to firstly acknowledge that in Newcastle here we're meeting on the lands of the Awabakal and Worimi peoples, and we pay respects to elders past and present, and we'd like to acknowledge and pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations peoples joining us here in the room today, on Zoom today, and I'd also like to say that sovereignty was never ceded. Today we have a kind of superstar, all-star cast of sociologists from the UK, where we have Becky Coleman from University of Bristol, Roger Burrows from the University of Bristol, and Bev Skeggs and Imogen from the University of Lancaster. Um, we're going to start with Becky, then move to Roger, then finish with Bev and Imogen. In terms of the crowd here today, can you please make sure that you have your sound on mute, and we're going to take all questions through the chat function only. So if as the speakers are talking and you have a question, please type it in. I'll monitor that on the way through. We'll ask a question or two to each of the presenters at the end of theirs, and then hopefully at the end we'll have some time to have a bit more of a broader discussion via the chat as well. So Becky, do you want to share your screen, and we'll start with you. Thanks.
Let's see. Can you see that? Can you see that and you can hear me? Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. It's so nice to be on a screen with you all, so many people I know and also people I don't. Thank you for the invitation. The whole seminar series looks great. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here talking about glitter, materiality, affect, and inequalities, although also kind of a bit unnerving to be speaking in relation to the much more evidently political materials of acid and mould. But part of what I want to do today is explore why and how I think about glitter in terms of politics and inequalities. And also a bit in relation to kind of futures making that comes in towards the end. So the paper draws on a book that was published in spring 2020, just as we were all in lockdowns. But the book is about glitter, futures, and politics, and it emerged in a bit of a strange way. So I was initially meant to be writing a book about different case studies of social science methodologies for studying futures. And the book is still about that, but I got really interested in glitter, and a book kind of shaped itself around that. So glitter became intriguing to me in a number of ways, and it struck me most explicitly following two collaging workshops that I organised in a girls' secondary school in southeast London, that was structured around a series of exercises where I asked them to imagine themselves in the present and the future through writing and then collaging. The workshops involved 12 year 9, so age 13 and 14-year-old girls, and were held in the art rooms of the school. And I brought a wide range of materials with me: paper, pens, stickers, pipe cleaners, stamps, magazines, and also some tubes of glitter. But I hadn't really anticipated the glitter becoming the focus of my attention, but it seemed to demand that I notice it and attend to it. So it moved from the collages themselves to human bodies and the classrooms as we and it became covered in it. So most of this was accidental, but sometimes it was deliberate as well. And the art teacher who I was working with, Claire Stanhope, described what had happened in the workshops as the young people kind of getting overtaken with the glitter. So I began to notice this movement of glitter around the classroom and beyond, but then also after the workshop. So on the bus home, or the bus to work, with a large bag and a suitcase, that glitter was kind of clinging to me and my clothes and my body. It was over kind of notebooks. And when I went to give the suitcase back to its owner, I tried to clean it, but there were still residues of glitter. So I began to understand glitter through feminist new materialist work. So as what Jane Bennett describes as vibrant matter. So this is a conception of matter that seeks to account for the kind of liveliness of things, where things have the capacity to act as quasi-agents or forces with trajectories, propensities, or tendencies of their own. She develops this term. Oh, I think someone's sound is on. She develops this term thing power to try to kind of capture this, which she said gestures towards the strange ability of ordinary man-made items to exceed their status as objects and to manifest traces of independence or aliveness. And she also talks about how these things then have this kind of autonomy of their own, and that this kind of operates in part through affect. So she talks about materials and kind of links that with affect and says that things can kind of command attention, and she describes being kind of struck by particular things. So she says at the very least these certain things kind of provoked affects in her. So Bennett's argument connects matter and affect, and thing power refers both to the capacity of things to act and for them to provoke affects as well. So I think we can put Bennett's concept of thing power together with Donna Haraway's argument, and this is an argument she's been making for a really long time, but in 2026 she writes about how it really matters what matters we use to think other matters with. So she's talking about how, and the last part of that quotation there, it matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. So this is part of her larger argument about the politics and ethics of worlding, or how worlds take shape. And I've kind of used that a bit to think around futures. So worlding and the creation of worlds as this kind of future-oriented kind of activity. And that this worlding occurs through potentially many different materials, and that different materials materialize the world differently. So putting Haraway and Bennett's argument together focuses attention on the effective capacity of materials in these processes of worlding. So I then began to notice the affectivity of glitter. So it followed me and I followed it, tracking different worlds that it was involved in making and shaping. And I'll talk about some of those in a minute. But also really focusing on the politics of these these kind of worlding, these world makings. So this involves honing feminist, new materialist and affect approaches to explore how glitter as an effective materiality is everywhere, and it has these different capacities to affect and be affected if we're thinking about affect from a Deleuzian conception, and is always in what Sarah Ahmed calls affective economy. So there's always a kind of a politics, there's always kind of series of power relations here. So for the young people that I work with in the art making workshops, glitter seem to be involved in worlding in these kind of absorbing and affectionate ways. So glitter became part of how they imagine their futures, and it was a material through which they could imagine their futures. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But just to say, it's not always the case that glitter isn't always positive. So we can begin to think about the kind of complexities, the contradictions, the ambiguities of glitter in lots of different ways. So think about the climate emergency in the UK. It might be the same in Australia and other parts of the world, but there's been a kind of backlash against glitter, especially in relation to Christmas decorations, but also it's been banned in some children's nurseries. So it's not a material that can be used for kind of art and craft making. But then at the same time, glitter is also a means for conservationists to track endangered species. And there was a talk at Bristol a couple of weeks ago around putting edible glitter in endangered species food. So when they poo, you can track them and track their movements and kind of see where they've been. So as a material then, glitter generates and it holds together a wide variety of affects and cultural judgments. And I think there's a longer story, and I do talk about this a bit in the book, that concerns the kind of histories and trajectories of plastics and the kind of politics of plastics as well. But we can expand this kind of idea that glitter is this kind of ambivalent, ambiguous, kind of contradictory material by looking at how it's central to LGBTQ plus culture and politics. So it's often used in makeup, clothes, and accessories to celebrate and identify kind of gay, queer, and transgender culture. And then in America in the 2010s, gay and queer protesters were involved in a series of glitter bombing of right-wing homophobic politicians and public figures. So this is Newt Gingrich, I think that's how his name is pronounced, being glitter bombed in 2011. And also an image of a glitter-filled, rainbow-filled extravaganza that took place outside the temporary home of Vice President Mike Pence in Washington in the days leading up to the 2017 inauguration of Donald Trump when he became president then. Beyond America, Germaine Greer was glitter bombed in Wellington in 2012 by a group protesting against transphobia. And in 2016, George Galloway, who is an ex-Labour MP and has a kind of quite complicated political kind of history, was glitter bombed during a talk at the University of Aberdeen. So here, kind of dousing politicians and other public figures in these kind of sparkly showers marks them with a material that's associated with childishness or trashy femininity, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute, and attaches the kind of positive LGBTQ plus affects to them. So in her book on glitter, Nicole Seymour notes that glitter often serves as a tool to blur gender lines. And I think this is kind of what's happening here, but also that glitter, the kind of material qualities of glitter makes it really difficult to kind of get rid of it. So more recently, ICE officers in the States have also been glitter bombed with protesters saying that the material sticks to them and helps other people identify them. So there's the kind of material properties, like it goes everywhere, but it also sticks and you can never kind of get rid of it. So it's been used in these different kinds of political kind of movements and protests. So then, perhaps unsurprisingly, glitter bombing generated irritation, annoyance, and anger in many of those who were targeted. So George Galloway did a really kind of funny, well, it read very funnily. He didn't mean it in a funny way, I don't think, kind of tweet saying, you know, it took him ages to kind of get rid of the glitter. He needed like lots of showers to get rid of it. Some of the politicians were saying how dangerous it was, comparing it with acid. Actually, Roger, that's kind of maybe an interesting link there, the kind of fear. They don't know what they're being, kind of what's being thrown over them. Yeah, and kind of wanting to press charges against people as well. But just following through that point around kind of why and how this irritation might be evoked in these particular politicians, it might stem from glitter being fundamental to mainstream girls' cultures and to childhood and femininity kind of more widely. So Mary Celeste Kearney talks about how sparkle is ubiquitous in mainstream girls' culture. And that this visual landscape is now dominated by sparkly brilliance. And Makita Ekwani also explores the significance of patina in representations of gendered celebrity culture, specifically in relation to luxury branding, and talks about how glitter serves to portray women as heteronormatively desirable, kind of fun and glamorous. So in the book, I wrote a bit more about this in relation to how it features in reality TV programme, looking especially at a largely white working class show, Towie, or The Only Way is Essex, that's based in Essex in England. And particularly, I mean, sparkle is kind of there throughout the kind of branding, but also in relation to the practice of vajazzling. So some of you might know what that means, but it's where women decorate their pubic mound with crystals, glitter, and other decorations. So, and I think there's a lot more kind of to say here in terms of like the association of class and femininity, kind of around ideas around kind of excess, and also Essex being associated with a particular kind of new money, kind of very aspirational, but also kind of very culturally derided kind of idea of femininity as well. So can begin to kind of think about this association of glitter with this particular kind of kind of working class femininity. And this is maybe kind of unsurprising in some way, in that Kearney, in that last quote there on the slide, talks about how sparkle is kind of associated with a kind of modern femininity around kind of empowerment, visibility, and independent wealth. What she also does, though, is notes how within visual culture, glitter is this kind of luminosity, or it has this kind of shimmery present that seeks to kind of frame or make visually superior what's being highlighted. So it's this kind of visual trope that elevates particular aspects of kind of visual culture. And I think you can see this in some of the collages and some of the artwork that the young people made in the workshops. So glitter is arranged in the shape of hearts, or it's placed next to a heart, and it kind of emphasizes that. So it really emphasizes the things that the young people kind of like and want to take with them into their futures. And it's used to frame particular aspects of an image. So you can see different examples of that there. So in these senses, then, glitter seemed to offer straight white working class women and the young women, the young people I work with, a kind of expansion of their possible futures. So glitter welded in these positive ways. And in many ways, I think that would be a nice point to end on. So it's a call for sociology and other social scientists to be attentive to the ways in which affective materials make new worlds. And I do think that's important, and it is an argument I'm making. But I also want to consider the ways in which the politics of glitter might involve other kinds of affects and temporalities. So another world that I follow glitter to is the 2001 film Glitter, which starred Mariah Carey and accompanied an album of the same name. And both the album and the film flopped, so they were commercial and critical failures, which I think is interesting in itself, in indicating that glitter isn't always this kind of positive affect or sensation. But also what I found interesting in the film is the way in which glitter's used as a device that functions temporarily to both suggest and undercut the possibility of a better future. So for those of you who haven't watched the film, it's loosely based on Carey's own Rag to Riches life story. And it follows the lead character, Billy Frank, who's played by Mariah Carey, as she develops a successful singing career, but also experiences a range of painful encounters and setbacks, which kind of cut through a simple trajectory to the good life. So the title of the film clearly indicates the significance of sparkle and shimmer to Billy's story, and it's used in a number of different ways on clothes and costumes, in makeup, in nightclubs, and it's also referred to in kind of glittering lights, reflective surfaces, and disco balls, among other things. But as well as these kinds of uses of of glitter to kind of emphasize these exciting changes to her life, it also are used to underscore kind of the pain and difficulty for this character. So in one scene, for example, where Billy is shooting her first video, which features a lot of glitter and sparkle, so that's in that second image there, the video's cut short as the director sexualizes Billy in a way that neither she or her boyfriend, who's kind of directing the video, are comfortable with. So it develops this kind of understanding of the politics, and if we're thinking about this in terms of kind of future politics, as convoluted and kind of trajectory. So it's both painful and hopeful. It signifies her upward social mobility, but not in this kind of straightforward trajectory into this better future. How am I doing for time? Have I got a couple more minutes? Yeah. So this analysis of glitter led me to another film where glitter functions in a similar way, and this is the film Precious, which tells the story of Clarice Precious Jones, an African-American 16-year-old growing up in Harlem, who, after being excluded from school for being pregnant for the second time after being repeatedly raped by her father, joins an alternative school. And glitter here, or kind of glimmer and sparkle, also kind of features in this quite ambivalent kind of way. So there are certain fantasy scenes that highlight the way in which Precious detaches herself from the violence of her everyday life and imagines a different and better time. So these occur at moments in the film when Precious is experiencing abuse and trauma. And one fantasy is a brightly lit scene where Precious and her light-skinned boyfriend in black tie exit a film premiere to many photographers and interviewers. And Precious happily signs autographs and tells an interviewer, "I feel great." And she's kind of lit by these flashes of multiple cameras kind of going off. So there's this kind of sparkle, kind of glimmer, shine. But this fantasy scene is interrupted by a thunderstorm where rain falls and glistens on her face. So again, this kind of glistening, and we are returned to Precious lying on the floor in her apartment, being woken from a fall by her mother throwing a bucket of water over her face. So the fantasy scenes then are both transitioned into and themselves kind of feature sparkle, shine and shimmer, not just through glitter itself, but sometimes glitter, but also through materials which have reflective or illuminating qualities such as water, autumnal leaves, snow, fabric and lights. So in some ways, then, these fantasy scenes provide a respite, mentally, if not physically, for Precious from the cruelty and violence that she experiences. But the luminosity of glitter also has this crucial role in the transitions between real life and fantasies. And they kind of indicate that the fantasies are only temporary and unsustainable moments of relief for Precious. So they do not signal this kind of smooth progression to a better future. And there's more to say here around kind of race and how race and gender and class kind of work together here. So Billy's race is explicitly commented on in the film Glitter. And interestingly, Mariah Carey has a role in Precious, and her kind of racial identity and yeah, it is questioned in that film as well. And in Precious and the novel Push by Sapphire, on which it's based, this is also an explicit commentary on the relations between race, gender and class in the States. So for both Billy and Precious then, the future is not necessarily better. Billy is the victim of abuse by her alcoholic boyfriend who's then murdered, and encounters pain and violence on her trajectory to being this international superstar. And despite becoming more educated, finding her voice, making friends and being a caring mother, towards the end of the film, Precious learns some devastating news and how her future will be kind of cut short. So glitter in these films then sets off a range of future politics, but in ways that complicate the idea of kind of this politics being around a better future. So to finish then, by following glitter to these different worlds and focusing on it as this kind of affective material, so thinking about the affects it elicits, generates, is involved in kind of shaping and arranging, and also thinking about some of its kind of material qualities, as well as then kind of moving into those films and thinking how it operates as a kind of stylistic kind of device. It's clear, I think, that what's often derided as a frivolous and superficial kind of material, or as dangerous in relation to the kind of environmental concerns about it, what these judgments do is make evident a range of class, gendered, race, sexualized and kind of aged values as well. So I think what I'm kind of interested in then is the way in which, if we think about kind of worldings and future makings, to think about how inequalities function there, or how these future making kind of materials are involved in kind of remaking existing inequalities, how and when this happens through different temporalities. And so then, yeah, that last question, what a focus on affective materials tells us about inequalities and the makings of different futures. No, there. Can't
Stay
hear you
muted.
on mute.
Sorry, I thought I got that off. So yeah, thanks, Becky. We have a couple of questions from the chat. Firstly, from Julian Molina. Really interesting presentation. I was curious whether you followed glitter through its global supply chains,
Yeah.
its relations to the plastic industry, and whether you had any thoughts about how those chains link to inequality.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't do that in the book, but I definitely think there's a bigger kind of project there. You could also look at Caroline Knowles's book around the flip-flop, and that's a kind of really great ethnographic study of how plastics travel and those kinds of questions around yeah, transnational inequalities. I did write a little bit about kind of plastic and especially thinking about so there's a really nice, I really liked an essay by Roland Barthes on plastics, where he talks about it as this kind of enchanting and kind of magical material when it was becoming kind of popularized and more prevalent. Oh, Caroline's here. I didn't know that. And so again, kind of thinking about those contradictions that are often kind of baked into these kinds of materials from the start. So yeah, there's also kind of interesting work. Jane Osgood has done interesting work around thinking around glitter and what's called kind of eco glitter and how often that's mined in I think in India and other kind of countries where it's young people, young girls especially doing this kind of mining. And so there's a whole kind of, you know, in the West, there's lots of kind of, we just need eco glitter, but actually there's a whole kind of history, or there's a whole other story to kind of unpack there around how these materials are kind of produced and kind of circulated.
Anchor asked, do you think glitter is also associated with nostalgia in the past? Thinking about Christmas, but also motherhood, finding glitter many years later on an old kitchen table kids used for crafting.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, I think that's another, I don't know, like lots of these calls for banning kind of glitter. Um, yeah, how that works in relation to kind of these ideas around kind of childhood, which I've talked more about how those are kind of used in deriding kind of ways. But yeah, I think there's a whole other series of affects and emotions to tap into there. I organised a workshop on glitter a few years ago with Jane Osgood at Goldsmiths actually, and we tried to use different kinds of glitter in that workshop. And one of the things was Jane brought in lots of what we called recycled glitter. So where she went through her daughter's art supplies and kind of makeup, glittery kind of nail polish, and we use those as well. And we kind of thought through some of the different affects and associations we had with using different kinds of glitter and what we might do with these things that we were producing as well in terms of the environment.
Excellent. Thanks, Becky. And if there's any more questions for Becky, please put them in the chat and we'll maybe get to them at the end when we have chat to everyone. So we'll get Roger now to start and share his screen, please.
Okay. Shall I start?
Yep.
Okay. This is a jointly written paper. I don't know whether Louise Ridley is online, but it's co-authored with Louise and some other colleagues. It's an interdisciplinary study based in Newcastle across sociology, criminology, public health, clinical sciences, planning. When people talk about acid attacks, when I say I'm doing research on acid attacks, there is a tendency to immediately assume that this is going to be a project about gender-based violence and men throwing acid in women's faces and eyes. And of course, that's an incredibly important topic to study. But this is not that study. This is a study which isn't really even about acid. It's actually about ammonia, but I'll explain the reason why that is the case. and it's to do with really looking at the statistics, I suppose, and finding out that actually in the UK, somewhere between about 74 and 88% of acid ammonia attack victims are male. They're often young, aged between 16 and 24. And a few years ago, it became apparent that the prevalence of this kind of attack is really very, very geographically concentrated. I'll just run straight to the figures, really, I suppose. Last year, it was estimated that there were 498 corrosive attacks, corrosive substance attacks, and not just to the eyes, but to the face. As we'll see from the data that I'm going to present, this is likely to be a massive underestimation of the extent of it. But what's really important from what I'm going to talk about is that actually a quarter of all of the attacks that were reported were in Northumbria. There was 121 cases. And what we found, I was based in Newcastle at the time we began the study, is that the acid attacks, ammonia attacks, were ubiquitous within certain parts of the city, and that they were concentrated in particular areas. The geodemographics of this phenomena is really quite precise, both where the attacks occur and where the victims, the perpetrators, the survivors actually live. And the project started after I was contacted by a clinician who's jointly written this paper, who just couldn't believe the number of young white working class men he was dealing with on a weekly basis, who essentially were coming into hospital blinded with acid and ammonia in their faces. And he's developed various kind of clinical interventions that I'll speak about towards the end of this talk. Now the figures are quite stark. The concentration of this phenomena in Northumberland, and especially within more deprived parts of Tyneside, speak for themselves, and the numbers are there, and we can see from a number of different sources that this is an epidemic of violence. But it was only really when it got publicity through someone who actually got killed through an acid attack that maybe people have begun to pay a little bit more attention to it. What we find in the data is that acid is a weapon of choice because it doesn't usually kill anyone. With knives and with guns, clearly there is always the risk that you commit murder. Whereas with acid, you simply blind people and disable them. But in this instance, this young man, unfortunately, was attacked in his home, and the ammonia that was thrown into his face went down his throat and burnt the back of his gullet. Essentially, had a heart attack and died. And so all of a sudden, this is a weapon that is now regarded as a deadly weapon alongside guns and knives. Now, we want to kind of try and understand what was behind this concentration of this weapon of choice within Newcastle. So, working with the eye surgeon, essentially, we began to try and talk to a number of people who had been subject to acid or ammonia attacks across the city, and maybe later, if Louise is here, she can talk to this. This is one of the most difficult studies we ever undertook in terms of simply gaining access and getting the agreement of the people who'd been attacked to talk to us. We were trying to interview them after they'd come for a clinical appointment, and they often didn't turn up for the clinical appointment, or if they did come for the clinical appointment, they'd often wander off. This is a population that is very, very hard to reach in all different sorts of reasons. It's a population that is, for the most part, quite kind of chaotic and not comfortable working with researchers or within institutional settings. But there are a large number of young men within this area who have been subject to these kinds of attacks. So anyway, in the end, we had about 35 people who we were attempting to interview. In the end, we managed to interview 14 of them. In a couple of instances, people being interviewed together, a couple of brothers that I'll talk about later on in the talk. But essentially, it's a qualitative study trying to understand what the hell is going on here in terms of the background of these people, the nature of the event, and the kind of experience that they went through. So I've got various bits of data here that I can talk to. Some of this is very troubling. It's actually quite difficult to present in a way that isn't kind of I don't know, sort of sensationalist or I don't want to do a kind of a, there's a style of criminology that seems to kind of celebrate male toxic masculinities and violence in terms of the kind of narrations that it gives. So I'm going to try and avoid that if I possibly can. But some of the tales are difficult to tell. Anyway, so we going to focus on 11 cases of the 14, all white males in the neighbourhood, and we've divided them into basically three types, based upon their kind of economic engagement and the level of criminality that they might or might not be engaged in. So I'm going to begin by looking at an example of someone who was, employed, was in work, and only had a tangential relationship to criminality. Then a middle group who are probably a little bit more precarious in terms of their involvement and their engagement with a range of different institutions. And then finally, in the group that in the data is clearly massively overrepresented in this, a group who are largely outside of the labour market and who have a long history of criminal involvement or involvement with the criminal justice system, people who are probably in some of the most extreme forms of deprivation, despair that we've come across. So I'm going to begin with Jack. All of these are obviously anonymized. Jack was 30 when we interviewed him. He's a tradesperson with his own business, lives in an area close to where he was born, Northumberland, with his partner and two kids. And he claims that he's had no previous involvement with the police. His story was about a member of what he calls a local criminal family who'd been harassing Jack's girlfriend, sending a text. So he arranged to have it out with him, arranged by phone. They were to meet in a local park in June 2023. Jack's a big lad, and he says he quickly overpowered the person in question, someone he described as an ex-friend, and was punching him on the ground. But then this person's girlfriend ran to the car that they'd arrived in and obtained a bottle of ammonia in a Lucozade bottle. And then allegedly she joined the fight and squirted ammonia into Jack's face. And he says this: "Yeah, well, what happened was I was on top of them and she squirts this from the side here. And I just remember I tried to shut my eyes. I knew if it got in my eye, I could have lost it. I was like that too. I think I've been lucky because I think I shut my eye, obviously ammonia in your eyes. And when it was burning away, and then obviously I went like this," and he's explaining how he was holding his eyes, and he jumped up and I went back after him. But then I thought, oh, this is bad. And he had to run to his grandma's house. It turned out his grandma lived locally to where the attack occurred. And we'll see that much of this violent activity is hyper-local. Everyone knows each other, and there's a certain oppressive nature to some of the community here. So he was in hospital for 6 days in total, and he has something that's going to be important to the end of this story. He has an amniotic membrane graft, a piece of mesh made from placenta stem cells that work reasonably well, and some of his sight has been restored. And although his experience with the kind of clinical intervention was successful, relatively successful, he couldn't say the same about the police. The police came to the hospital and interviewed him. The police claimed not to have enough evidence, so they dropped the case. Even though Jack could identify the perpetrator and still sees him walking around the street, he knows him well and still sees the person who's blinded him by throwing ammonia in his eyes. And he reports, not surprisingly, new vulnerabilities. But Jack is a particularly emblematic case of a theme that runs through many of the interviews. It is what it is. There's a certain inevitability about it. There's a certain kind of fatalistic, masculinist tropes abound within many of these discourses. Worse things happening in China, doesn't it? I'm a pretty strong person. You just got to get on with it. There's a a very, very strong theme about the inevitability of this. Graham, I won't look at in so much detail. Graham was 37. He was in work, but a little bit more precarious. He was attacked alongside his brother just before COVID. He's one of three brothers. He's always worked, most recently in the building trade. Has a partner and a child who they've now split up in the aftermath of the attack. This is a very common theme in terms of the implications of these attacks on people's domestic lives. He and his brother had been drinking all day to celebrate his birthday, and they ended up in a local club close to their home. And an incident, and it's unclear even to them, I think, exactly what happened within the pub. But they went outside to confront someone who'd been, pushing them or being problematic. And this person evidently called some friends who arrived in a car. I won't read all the material. You can have a look at it if you want to read the paper or see it. But essentially, three or four lads piled out of the car and threw ammonia at one brother and acid at the other brother, and in their eyes, both of them, both brothers were attacked. He describes the smell of ammonia, it being familiar because he used to dye his hair, and then acid as well. And he had a puffer jacket on, and he said it just kind of went like a crisp packet, just kind of dissolved. They booked an ambulance, went to the hospital. Police, despite having CCTV and knowing who the perpetrators were, failed to get any prosecution. And this is a story that happens time and time again. The police seem unable to actually investigate or to bring any or very few of these people to trial. So he's 6 days in hospital. He reports during COVID, little support, lots of anxiety, lots of drinking, poor sleep. The relationship with his partner broke down despite repeated attempts, downward mental health spiral, and it ended with him trying to take his own life through an overdose. He was off work for 7 months. He's now back at work, started going to the gym again, but he's very critical about the lack of support, but understands perhaps that COVID made this more difficult than it might have otherwise have been. Now, most of the cases, however, come into this final category, those who are marginalised and criminally entangled in really quite profound ways. I'll just take a couple of these because these in a sense are very, very kind of clearly representative of the bulk of the people who are coming through the eye clinic. Daryl was 34. That's from a large family, 4 brothers and a sister. He reports that his mum moved away and his dad has another family. And from the age of 13, he's lived with friends and hasn't had a fixed abode. He's back in contact with his mum now, but she's very ill with back pain. And he's just split up with his partner and a 1-year-old daughter and is living back with his mum. He reports he never really went to school much due to panic attacks, invoked, he thinks, by smoking skunk from a very early age. And from 14 or so, he suffered from severe anxiety. He reports being repeatedly attacked in his locality. And since we interviewed him, he was stabbed in the leg just walking down the street, he reports. He's never really worked. He says he's done a little bit of van stuff, but nothing else. He's been to prison seven times since the age of 21. And he reports various poor experiences with the police, including having CS gas thrown in his eyes, and he refuses to talk to them. What happened had occurred 4 months before the interview. He was attending a funeral of a friend who had taken his own life, had thrown himself off a bridge. And the incident happened at the funeral. He went to the toilet. There was a smashed glass at the wake following the funeral, and someone in the bathroom squirted ammonia from a white bottle. Someone else who was attending the wake. He knows who it is, but he won't talk to the police. He won't grass the person up. And he didn't want to call the ambulance in case the police attended. And so a friend took him to hospital. He's in hospital for a week. He had a successful operation, no pain, but still has blurred vision. And he found much kindness in hospital. He was a changed person, I think, in terms of the kind of the care and attention that he received. whereas most of his experiences with other kind of institutions had not been positive at all. Insisted that the police should not be involved, and he'd never grass or cooperate with the police. As I've said, after discharge, he was stabbed in the leg in another seemingly unrelated incident, but he hasn't got medical attention. He's self-medicating using what he calls heart tablets and Valium from the street, reports poor sleeping patterns, finds it hard to leave the house, huge levels of anxiety, seems unable to access GP services, and as part of the interview, we were able actually to refer him to actually get some support for his mental health. Last one, but you get a flavour of the sorts of processes here. This is Bob and Billy. They are from a very close-knit family, a family history of alcohol abuse and violence. Bob didn't really go to school very much. He's been in prison quite a lot. His mum and dad split up before high school. His dad died at the age of 42 when Bob was just 17. And he's had a long history of problems with alcohol addiction, alcohol abuse. He's worked at a car wash and has taken various courses, but he really struggles to keep appointments. In fact, whilst we were interviewing him, the phone went because he should have been in court facing charges that he'd forgotten about. Really been a bit of a downward spiral, smoking pot, drinking, struggles with alcohol. Anyway, the event was in Whitley Bay, which is a seaside resort just outside of Newcastle. He was at a house party when acid was squirted into his eyes. But rather than going to hospital, he went on a bender. He drunk for 3 days whilst the ammonia ate through his eyes. And it was only when he went to the bar and was in such a state that they rang an ambulance, and he was cuffed in handcuffs by the police and taken to the hospital. He was in hospital for 4 days for an operation, but his understanding of the procedure is hazy at best. He reports in the interview that they'd put some baby placenta in his eye, which is the mesh that's made with placenta. And now no sight in one eye, problems with ulcers, finding taking eye drops and tablets difficult, and he's mostly homeless, and so he doesn't follow the regime. Now the eye mesh is not cheap. The procedure is quite expensive, and there's a kind of a frustration amongst clinicians that many of the people who have this procedure don't then conform or are unable to conform to the regime of eye drops and care of self. Okay, 2 minutes. I nearly finished. What was interesting was that Billy, his brother, was there, and towards the end of the interview, rather matter-of-factly, he also reported that he himself had been attacked with acid and ammonia in the eyes on 2 occasions. It was as normal as that it was hardly worth mentioning. So let me just finish with some kind of emergent themes, really, about what this says. The social geography of this is really interesting. There's a very precise geodemographics of these attacks. The people tend to live in areas with particular characteristics, and they often know each other. There's something really interesting here about the double-edged nature of local communities. People know each other. They've known each other for years. They know each other's families, but these can be incredibly oppressive, terrible places when it's your neighbour or indeed family members who have been involved in engaging in this kind of violence. There's no grassing. Everyone knows everyone. If you go to the police, you're going to get into further trouble. Most of the people that we spoke to have chaotic lifestyles, basic inability to make appointments or to deal with a whole range of kind of institutional aspects of life, including care of self and actually turning up for the appointment at the hospital and so on. Lots of toxic masculinity, a lot of fatalism. It is what it is, but a real normalization of ultra violence, a certain inevitability for some of these young men that this is going to happen. The police are disinterested. There's a huge amount of underreporting. They all nearly report excellent clinical provision, but really poor aftercare in the community. Ammonia, in particular, is a weapon of choice in these neighbourhoods. It's less likely to kill compared to guns and knives, and it's not really regulated. You can access ammonia very, very easily, put it into a Jiffy bottle, put it into a Lucasade bottle, and carry it around with you. And it's a very hard to reach population for clinical care and social support. But just in conclusion, I mean, it's a very specific instance, but it just seems to us to be an example of slow violence. It's about the harms that build up over time through unemployment, poverty, poor housing, addiction, and service withdrawal. It's about advanced marginalities. We all know the history of the region, the collapse of industry, dismantled stable working community bonds, leaving precarity and stigma. And the structural harms creates insecurity and frustration, setting the stage for conflict. Interpersonal violence becomes a way of asserting status or negotiating insecurity. This is a neighbourhood which has a history of coal mining, of shipbuilding, of heavy industry. Although it's 3 or 4 generations ago, those tropes still exist. Deeper harms clearly result: weakened social bonds, normalised insecurity, entrenched disadvantage. The cycle repeats, embedding violence into everyday life rather than isolating it as exceptional. But I just want to end with one final slide, which is about something that is deeply ironic about this, which is that the clinical innovation is remarkable. Amniotic membrane grafts and stem cell transplants can restore vision after chemical burns. The repair capacity is advanced, but simple prevention, simple social and public policy and policing hasn't matched what's possible clinically. The extraordinary healing coexists with everyday prevention failure. But something ironic and something profound here, I think, about placenta-derived tissue symbolizes how feminized, invisible care infrastructures are used to patch harms rooted in neglect and violence. These harms are not purely medical, but linked to class disadvantage and male-to-male conflict. The placenta, the organ of life, is redeployed to heal injuries caused by social abandonment and structural inequality. So science can heal, and they're quite happy to pour many thousands of pounds into these innovations and these clinical procedures. But they seem unwilling. When I say they, a whole range of actors seem unable to address the failures of prevention, justice, accountability, and social inequalities. And clearly, without structural change, this is going to continue. Healing remains necessary through these kinds of clinical interventions, but clearly insufficient to actually deal with this particularly vile manifestation of violence within these deprived communities.
Thanks, Roger. So we haven't had. Oh, yep, we do have a question. Thank you, Matt. I'm still on. Yeah, okay. So awful but important work. This is from Matt Wade. Perhaps a naive question and not on the theme of this seminar, but given you mentioned traditional masculinist tropes at play, what role do norms around honor and dishonor play in making these attacks not only thinkable but indeed seemingly permissible and accepted as a weapon of choice?
Well, I think that's inevitably the case. I think. I mean, the language, the discourse, the whole notion of kind of the code of the street and of kind of long-going conflicts is an inherent part of many of these issues. Louise is here now as well, so she might be able to contribute to some of these questions. But yes, I think there is clearly I don't want to have a very kind of simplistic model of heavy industry deindustrialization being generative of this form of violence. But there is something quite interesting about the precise concentration of this kind of violence within these particular areas and these particular neighbourhoods, which map almost perfectly onto the old shipbuilding communities.
Carolyn Knowles comments that it replicates the slow violence of state and labour market apart from the NHS, which is, I suppose, also an interesting thing to think about in a time where the NHS has been kind of fundamentally dismantled by the looks of it from over here. I suppose a question I've got is in relation to the seemingly lack of way that the police take this seriously, and maybe acid or ammonia as a weapon of choice. Are those two things connected, or has it just got more to do with the kind of general relations between police and the community, that there's kind of not much care going on from the police towards community, or does it have something to do with the kind of idea that acid or ammonia isn't a serious weapon and it's not knives or guns and therefore we won't really bother with this?
it's a mixture of all those things, and Louise might know a little bit more about the specificities of what's going on. But these are neighbourhoods which are policed in a very different way to other neighbourhoods within the northeast. And I think from the police point of view, it's just local people throwing acid in each other's eyes, and so they might as well just get on with it. And
Yep.
no one will cooperate with them, and it will be an enormous waste of time because no one will turn up to court. So
Okay.
it's a kind of a containment exercise. Now, when things happen, when someone is murdered, or when, as in one instance, a policeman is blinded by this, things alter and things
Yep.
move in a different direction. When it's just young men throwing acid into each other's eyes or moaning to each other's eyes, in general, I'd say that it's not been a priority for the
Yep.
police. And the NHS, and especially the eye clinic in Newcastle, has had to pick up a huge range of things. People turn up saying they've had an accident, or they've accidentally got ammonia thrown in their eyes, when the clinicians know perfectly
Mm.
well that it's part of an exercise like this.
Yep. So
People
Louise, I see Louise is there. Have you got your tech stuff sorted out? Can you?
I don't, can you hear me? Can
Yeah.
you?
Yeah.
Oh my God, thank you. No, I mean, I agree with everything that Roger's just said there, but I think it's also, the crime itself is viewed as almost very casual, and the way it's delivered through perhaps a Lucozade bottle or a fizzy drinks bottle as well, I think also limits the kind of the sense of this, how serious that type of crime is. But I also think it's carried out in communities that are so distant from what we'd like to see, policing be in the perfect world. And they've almost created a world where, they're exempt from policing, but also nobody wants to go to the police either to say that this crime's happened. So that lack of trust, that breakdown of communication in these communities I think it's vast. I mean, it's almost bigger than it's ever been. In my times of teaching criminology, I think these communities are so far distant from perhaps our lives and how we'd like to see our lives. And that was also evident in, as Roger identified initially, actually getting people to come and speak to us. I've worked with people in prison. I've worked really hard to reach groups. This was the group that was by far the hardest I've ever had to reach in any aspect of my 30 years of criminology.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, thanks, Roger and Louise. I'll get you to stop sharing your screen there, Roger, and Bev, if you can upload yours, and we'll move on to Bev and Imogen, who are going to talk about mould.
Okay.
Yep, it's working.
Yeah. Okay. So we came to this study on mould. As you know, we probably both have worked for centuries on symbolic economies, but we came to this through our activist work with different groups before and during COVID. So Imogen was doing a lot of work with the Poverty Truth Committee, and then as a result started working with Ian Sinner, who's a paediatric consultant in respiratory problems. And I've been working with the Northwest Public Health BME group during COVID, recording deaths and trying to understand racism in COVID deaths. So it came from a different position, really, from our usual type of research. Now, you all know that infrastructures in the UK are just being completely destroyed. Everything. It's all privatised in various different ways, and that's what we're going to look at. So everything we do, water, sewage, food, breathing, soil, the food that we eat. And we're looking at the kind of the elemental pollutants and how they become part of us and how they kill us, literally. So we're talking about both slow and fast violence. And after Rogers, which I feel a bit shaken by, actually, after Rogers, this gets even worse. So kind of be prepared, because we're looking at things like genetic inheritance of these problems as well. And as Roger noted, it's very difficult to escape. And one of my key questions in all of this, and this came from where are the protections anymore? You know, who is protecting us at work in terms of what we eat? So the significance of the massive deregulations we've had over everything always has to accompany the understanding of what's happening, because those regulations did protect us. And trade unions did protect us, and all sorts of things protected us. The NHS, they're going. We have very little protections, and that's why we think it's a fight for life. So we developed this framework, and it draws from a lot. So I'm not going to go through it all, but you'll know most of it. It draws from kind of necropolitics, thanatocracy, biopolitics, molecular politics, biolegitimacy, depotentialization, economization of life, subjects of value. And I put these together again during COVID to think about how necroeconomics is a purposeful predatory imperative to basically be completely uncaring about sectors of the population, indifferent, allow them to die. We know the debates about surplus subjects, but also as people become disposable, they're also being made disposable in terms of protection. They don't need protecting, but also they can become a subject of profit. So I was looking also, as well as at BME COVID deaths, I also before that was looking at elderly care. So not only do you kill elderly people really quite quickly, you actually enable some of them to live so you can make more profit from them. So it really is a laying to waste. It's about the value less, but it's also about the relationship between capital and state. And in a way, we want to keep that big frame, that big picture, because if we look at, as we did, particular case studies, we can see how these play out and how they become embodied in very different places. So again, it's kind of a place-based study. And we were looking at Rochdale, and it became really significant to us. So I'm going to hand over to Imogen now, who's going to tell us the case study.
Yeah, so this is quite a famous case in the UK that you might have heard of, but this is one of the cases that we have been thinking with, which is the case of Awab Ishaq. So Awab Ishaq is 2-year-old, just a 2-year-old boy who died on the 21st of December in 2020 at Royal Oldham Hospital, just a few days after his second birthday. He'd had breathing problems for some time. His parents had taken him to an urgent care centre in acute respiratory distress. They tried to ventilate him, but were unable to do so because his trachea was so swollen. They took him in an ambulance to hospital, but he had a cardiac arrest in the ambulance and died that same day. And next slide, Bev. An inquest into his death was heard in 2022 in North Manchester. And the forensic pathologist gave evidence that there were fungal spores in Awab's blood and lungs, and acute swelling of his trachea and bronchia, which had meant that they couldn't get the tube down. And this swelling was caused by something called severe granulomatosis tracheobronchitis. And granulomas are immune cells that form in the body in reaction to infections, inflammations, irritants, or foreign objects. And in his case, these very unusual in a young child, these granulomas had formed in response to breathing in fungal spores in Awab's home. And the building inspector who gave evidence at the inquest inspected the flat 2 days after his death and gave evidence that there was significant mould in every room of the property, and agreed that the property was unfit for human habitation. And the conclusion of the coroner's report that Awab had died directly due to exposure, prolonged exposure to mould in his home environment. So he died, in short, because he'd been forced to breathe in polluted air, which was polluted with fungal spores in this damp mold-infested flat. His parents had complained multiple times to their social landlord, Rochdale Borough Housing, to whom we'll return, that the environment they were living in was making their baby unwell. He'd been treated for respiratory illness several times, but nothing was done. The year before his death, Channel 4 TV had broadcast a program called Dispatches, New Landlords from Hell, that investigated indoor air pollution on the health of children and infants living in properties owned and managed by another social housing landlord called, ironically, Sanctuary Housing, a massive social landlord. And one of the storylines focused on another baby called Jensen, who'd been hospitalized 26 times in the first year of his life and diagnosed with something called reactive airway disorder, an asthma-like condition in which his bronchial tubes were reacting to irritants, again, mold, in his home environment, leaving him wheezing and struggling for breath. And this documentary had vividly depicted the uninhabitable conditions this family and many others were living in, with damp water running down the walls, mattresses wrapped in plastic because of mold. And again, in this case, the mum explains how they've been unable to get the social landlord to fix the property, despite providing evidence, letters from GPs, hospitals, environmental health officers, politicians, the evidence that the conditions in the home were impacting their baby's health. There's been many more of these documentaries and exposés by journalists and activists, both before and after Awab's death in 2020. Next slide, Bev. So we...
I didn't realise that was happening.
So we began thinking with Awab's case and these other cases and this sort of data and talking to medics as well who were treating these children about what inhaling these necroeconomic conditions means. So Cavillo details how air has been used as a free and limitless dump site for the waste of industrial pollutants for a long time. And Michelle Murphy's work's really important here in kind of getting us to think about how these infrastructures of chemical violence become enmeshed with human living beings. Late capitalism, as Murphy puts it, is inhaled, pulled into your lungs through membranes, attaching to receptors, rearranging metabolism, altering our genetics in inheritable ways. In a material sense, pollutants chemically alter us, they become us. Next slide. But in sociology, breathing has not been very central to our debates about inequality and injustice. And we want to think or argue that thinking with breathing allows us for consideration of harms as they're enacted between our bodies, social relations, and the structural and elemental conditions in which we live. A recent body of scholarship has drawn new threads of connection, go back, Bev, between unbreathable lives and histories of enslavement, colonial capitalism, environmental racism, racist incarceration, bordering and policing practices. And notably in 2020, I can't breathe became the mantra of the global Black Lives Matter protests, triggered by a viral video of George Floyd being suffocated by police in Minnesota. And these kind of public lynchings graphically illustrate Fanon's rendering of conditions of Black life in white supremacist societies as what he terms combat breathing. As Apter argues, racial injustice is characterized by systematic and structural suffocation. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, the class race politics of breathlessness was, of course, foregrounded on a global scale. The pandemic forced us to confront the fact that we share our airspace. Face masks and social distancing became emblems of the kind of abject intimacy of communal respiration. And no one could fail to notice that the lungs that were straining against the COVID-19 virus were often the very same lungs that historically have struggled against non-viral forms of air pollution. Next slide. And it's worth saying in this regard, in relation to the pandemic, in the UK and in other contexts, the government responses were quintessential necroeconomic. They were driven by profit seeking and neglect of working class communities and frontline workers. In Britain, the vulnerability to the harms of air pollution has increased as the population living in poverty has risen, but particularly the population living in deep poverty or destitution. The deepening of poverty has led to and maps on to an increase in respiratory disease. And you can read the facts about poverty in the UK really easily, particularly using Joseph Rowntree data. But in particular, what's been noticeable during austerity that's ongoing is an increase in child poverty. And the UK has got the highest increase in child poverty in the EU. And diseases of child poverty are notably have increased as poverty in this group has increased. And health inequalities are particularly evident in respiratory disease and in childhood respiratory disease. And childhood respiratory disease is in turn a key predictor of population level mortality. So next slide. What became clear as we did this research is that for babies and children whose lungs are still developing, breathing in Britain has become a dangerous activity, not only outdoors, which is we know more about in terms of air pollution, but also indoors. And it's indoor air pollution that we're particularly interested in here. And the fact that we spend 90% of our time in the UK indoors. Exposure to indoor pollutants is becoming an increasing area of concern for policy and public health. So the irrepressible mould in homes like the ones in which Awab lived is encouraged not just by poor building quality, by unavoidable spores in the air, by lack of airflow, but by the financial cost of heating and humidity control. So it's directly linked to what charitable campaigns in 2023 in the UK called Heat or Eat, the fact that people now have to choose between heating or eating. You have to be able to heat your home and open the window if you live in a damp property to absorb the humidity which feeds mold. So it's this impossible situation for people living on low incomes where they have to keep a home both warm and open the windows. In order to have any attempt to combat mould in some properties. In 2024, the government estimated that 9 million households in the UK were fuel poor, and the advice that they give to people living in poverty in damp mouldy homes is to turn on the heating and open the windows. So the preventable death of our bishop really surfaced connections in the public sphere around the connections between indoor air pollution, child respiratory disease, state housing policy, and these struggles of people living on low incomes. Awab and his parents lived in a one-bedroom flat on an estate called the Freehold Estate in Rochdale. It was built in the late 1960s, early 70s, and it's managed, as I said, by a social housing association, which we'll mention what that means in a moment. And they'd first reported problems with this property in 2017. So before their son was born, they're told to paint over the mold. That was the response. It kept returning. They kept complaining. They became fearful for the health of their child. They made an application to be rehoused to no avail. In the UK, landlords, both social and private landlords, are in theory legally obligated to make repairs in a reasonable time frame. And if they don't, tenants can begin a legal process called a disrepair process to force them to act. But they're only advised to do this as a last resort and often leads to punitive measures like eviction, basically. But they did instruct a solicitor, Awab's parents, to make a claim against the social housing provider. The social housing provider then sent a repair team to the property who noted the presence of mould, but suggested it was caused by the lifestyle and bathing habits of the family, making references to ritual bathing and styles of cooking, explicit racism, to which I'll return in a moment. So the family were blamed basically for the mould. No efforts were made to treat the mould, improve ventilation, or trace sources of this damp. A health visitor wrote on behalf of the family, nothing was done. An inquest found fatal mould in the flat was caused by inadequate ventilation that would have required highly specialist intervention. And a housing expert later described the flats as what he called sweatbox flats, buildings designed not to breathe. And what we found through looking at lots of investigative journalistic work in this area, actually more than academic research, was repeated cases, including on this estate, but across the UK, of people being told that it was their fault, and including the repetition of a phrase that people being told that we're breathing too much, that the mould and damp in their homes was being caused by them breathing too much. 5 years after Awab's death, journalists were still finding hundreds of properties on the same estate and others in this condition. In 2023, Blackpool Council, also in the northwest of England, discovered that every single one of its privately rented homes had a damp and mold problem, and 70% of the homes in the most densely populated areas of the town posed a serious and immediate risk to the health of the people forced to live in them. So basically, it's estimated at least 1.5 million children are living in homes like this in the UK, in damp and mouldy homes, which are a significant harm to their health. It's a public health crisis. If we think about this like historically, I'm going to very, very quickly. If we think about Rochdale in Lancashire, in the northwest of England, we can think about longer histories of laboured breathing in this region, in industrial towns, which is a really important history for thinking about these repetitions and which areas are impacted by these conditions in the present. Okay.
So very briefly, you'll see the reason why social housing is in such a state. And it really began with a vengeance in 1980 and Thatcher's right to buy, the attempt to manipulate people into voting Conservative by allowing them to buy their own council houses. Since then, 2 million council homes have been sold, and the majority have been bought by private landlords. At the same time as local authorities, there's a complex financial model here that I'm not going to go into, have been unable to either repair, build or support their properties. So what we see is an absolute critical shortage of reasonable housing and the sale of social housing. What we see, and this comes from Brett Christopher's brilliant work, of course, deregulation, the control of housing supply. The government is put under pressure not to build, but they pretend they are going to build. The landlords allow housing to deteriorate so much that profit can be extracted, and it's actually cheaper to face a legal fine than repair the houses. Now, what you see when you look into the complexity of all this, and boy, is it complex, is that some of the properties were given away to capital to get them off the hands. Rochdale was a really, really interesting case because it tried to make social housing into a cooperative, you know, where the local people would own the housing, but basically it failed. It was taken over by private assets and money was sucked out of it. When you look at the Rochdale housing accounts, it's quite astonishing. What we see more generally is the state is basically an ATM machine for capital, and it literally just gives private landlords lots of money. That's the detail. But what's significant is there's hardly any consistent data that you can analyze. We still see massively high salaries for executives and managers. And I think the biggest shock that we see is that, you can watch lots of YouTube videos where social housing is advertised as a kind of get rich quickly mechanism, because you do not have to care about the type of housing it is. Now, we also want to say that we want to bring our older research back into this in terms of the people who are being treated like this. The people who live in these houses is a bit like the uncaring police. They're just not considered to be human. And they know this. They know this. The report on Awab's death was just unbelievable, a bit like Grenfell. You know, the racism and the complete intolerance of the people who were complaining was really significant. So we have to bring in Grenfell, because there's been a lot of this happening around Britain. There's been a lot more buildings on fire since Grenfell that haven't been covered, but people are fighting back, and we think this is really significant. People do know this is going on, but there's very little they can do about it. So they come up with great slogans. And if we're thinking about Becky's paper and affects, you know, it's anger, rage, despair, frustration. You know, what people cannot move out of their homes because they're given even worse accommodation and families are split up. So they know what's happening. And meanwhile, just to put this in, because we couldn't resist, we see the absolute monetization. So we've got the financialization of housing and the monetization of safe air across the world, which is very, very well documented now. So to conclude, we want to say this is not just class struggle, not just anti-racism. This is the fight for life against state-sanctioned predatory capital. We called the paper we wrote on this a license to kill, because the state basically gives a license and pays. It pays out to kill the people it doesn't want. It doesn't want them. It's not prepared to look after them through the welfare state, through the National Health Service in various ways. And interestingly, BMJ have been really significant in also resisting or trying to protect a lot of the children. So it comes back to, how do we protect? Mould is dormant in our bodies. If you have a stem cell transplant, it could take over your body and kill you. It's literally going back to a politics of eugenics, because we know the black mold restricts fetal development. And we also know, and it's horrific when we found this paper and we didn't quite know how to write it, that black mold restricts fetal development in the development of the unborn child. But again, there's been so much symbolic delegitimation that people who are living in these conditions are blamed for them. They breathe too much. So what we want to say is that these pollutants that we've been looking at are actually based on a purposeful policy. We can no longer say that it's kind of state ineffectiveness or the state failing forward. You know, some of these housing estates were sold for £2. So there's a purposeful politics going on there. And finally, to conclude, necroeconomics is in us.
Thanks for Imogen. So I'll just Celia Roberts has a question for your paper here. Thanks for the great paper. Is climate crisis also exacerbating this issue? More rain, warmer temperatures? If so, another case where climate crisis impacts deprived communities more intensely?
Yeah, definitely. Especially west on the Atlantic coast, facing places like the northwest of England, which are getting wetter, and flooding, etc. So definitely, this is a really good example of how climate is exacerbating actively things like respiratory disease and damp, mouldy housing, environmental conditions.
Yeah. Do you have any other questions for Bev and Imogen? I mean, I think something that kind of both yours and Roger's papers speaks to is that maybe we need to be bringing back the concept of social murder and social death much more as sociologists, making those high priorities in terms of what's going on, you know, in terms of the specifics of your papers and the politics that's happening in the US at the moment.
So in the longer paper, and I just reference it very, very quickly on histories, that's where we kind of do that work by thinking back through Engels in particular, because it's literally next door to what Engels was writing about,
Yeah.
A long time earlier. And the descriptions of properties, particularly of Irish migrants living in Salford, is not so very dissimilar at all to the conditions that are described in the evidence around damp and mouldy homes in the same areas. So there's this kind of direct forms of repetition, even if the pollutants shift and change.
Yeah.
I mean, just one thing to add, that which we didn't add about this paper, is really depressing paper in some ways, that's trying to bring all these different scales and structures and political economies of this and genetics into embodied inequalities together. But the paper really came out of a kind of very hopeful sorts of work that we were doing and have done with like coalitions of medics. And in AWAB's case, we saw coalitions around investigative journalism, which still exists to some extent. Lawyers working pro bono on this case in particular, but on others, clinicians putting on special clinics and kind of trying to fight local authorities on how. So, in an interesting way, there's this kind of fight back going on that's quite very coalitional across multiple types of public work and space that's very grassroots and not so grassroots around this stuff, that I think is a kind of scene of hope and resistance to these kind of necroeconomic conditions. I just wanted to flag that as a more positive note, and that's really was one of the key how Bev and I actually ended up doing this work, was being involved in those coalitions as academics.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a couple of questions that I think this one from Jessica Gerard here that incorporates some stuff from all the talks, but is aimed at Bev and Imogen. And I think we might have some wider questions that we can all kind of come at then. So the first one, thank you for these interesting timely talks. I have a question for Bev and Imogen, but it springs off Becky's talk and has relevance for Roger's too. I'm thinking about affect and these materialities, and thinking in particular about how mould is aligned with dirt and is associated with disgust and shame. That, of course, rationalizes policies, governance practices that can strategically ignore poverty and violence in terms of Roger's talk. And mould, even when these policies create the conditions for mould in the first place. So the question is, how are you thinking through mould as shaping broader discourses and assumptions about poverty and inequalities?
Well, in a way, it's probably through the activism that we can't, as academics, get very far. I think we need to work with people who are campaigning. I also think mothers have become very significant in these fights. So the case of the first legal case in the UK about a young girl dying in Lewisham from breathing in polluted air. It's the first legal case that is about pollutant death. It was through her mother and the coroner's campaigning, with lots of other groups getting involved. And I think that's really significant. I think there's when you say to me placenta politics, Roger, I thought you were going to talk about kind of different sort of inherited genetic placenta politics. But I think there is something about this is it's not just like inherited class, poverty, whatever. This is inherited genetic structures. The chances of unborn children getting born, the chances of babies living in these houses, which are getting worse because they don't need to be repaired, and climate change is getting worse. So I think that there's a whole politics going on around that, and challenging the state at every level. I mean, they are dismembering the group I was in, got disbanded. But you've got to keep fighting, but in coalition. I think Imogen's point there is absolutely crucial.
Thank you. Celia has a comment there about bushfire smoke and not being able to get funding to kind of get some research about the impact on bushfire smoke to babies. There's a researcher at the University of Newcastle that's doing research on this. Her name's Vanessa Murphy. So if Celia, if you're still there, you might want to contact her. And just I'm going to ask Julia's question here, and this is kind of to all the speakers, so feel free to jump in. It's been so interesting, though physically affecting and distressing, here about the inequalities and politics of and future making through the mundane micro materials of daily life. Maybe if there's time, all the speakers could reflect a little bit on the materialities of inequalities that are linking across the papers. So, Becky, I might ask you to go first, Becky, if that's possible. Or do you want someone else to go first?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm kind of still processing Roger and Bev and Imogen's papers as well. I mean, maybe one of the things is, and Bev mentioned this, is around, well, that maybe there's something kind of around kind of affect and yeah, trying to kind of think around the sorts of affects that different materials kind of generate, and then yeah, kind of modes of responding to those things. So I'm kind of thinking about like the irritation and anger that was kind of generated by the LGBTQ glitter bombing of these kind of right-wing politicians, um, and how that was kind of deliberate, like it was a deliberate strategy. But there was also, you know, glitter was chosen as the material to do that very deliberately because of its longer history within, you know, kind of queer, gay, and trans culture. But also there was lots of care taken about the kinds of glitter that was thrown over people. So often it was kind of like much larger pieces of glitter because that was seen as kind of less potentially dangerous as well. So there was this whole kind of complicated kind of considerations that went into some of those protests, but that was around generating, you know, anger, irritation, and yeah, I wonder whether there's something kind of there. And then I was just thinking about Jessica's comment around the things that can be strategically ignored. And I was also kind of thinking about some of the climate and environmental concerns around glitter, and you know, the way that then bans are seen as we ban this, but it's often in, yeah, kind of children's activities or you know, kind of Christmas decorations and stuff. But I think one of the things that Nicole Seymour talks about in her book on glitter is actually lots of the micro kind of plastics that come from glitter are actually in kind of clothing. And so there's a whole, again, it's this really complicated landscape, and there are certain kinds of things that get picked up on and kind of moved with, but that then allow a whole lot of other things to just be kind of neglected or kind of not brought to the surface. So yeah, those were some of the things I was thinking.
Yeah. Bev or Imogen or Roger, you want to chime in?
I wonder about two or three things, really. I mean, we talk about the state, but I think the state itself has changed. State has also been hollowed out, and it's actually quite difficult to identify what the public sector is anymore. It itself has been commodified, and the kind of movement of kind of CEO type, you know, capital is all the relative autonomy of the state is no longer an issue. It seems to me that capital is embedded within within the state. But linked to that, I suppose the thing that came to mind was actually about theories of social reproduction. I mean, essentially, the view of the kind of eugenics wing of finance capital is that, you know, a significant proportion of the population is surplus to requirements. And therefore, if we can extract some value out of them by other means other than surplus value, because they're not going to be working, you know, this is literally a kind of a necroeconomics. This is a slow form of death in terms of, you know, we're seeing it already. We look at the epidemiological evidence in terms of people getting shorter, of people's life expectancy changing. You know, this is, you know, I remember Danny Dorling used to think about how we could visualize it in terms of, piles of dead babies, just in terms of thinking about the real impact of this in terms of years lost. So those two things together, the nature of the state is now, infused with certain aspects of capital itself, and social reproduction is no longer something that's being applied to a significant proportion of the population. We're finding ways and means of letting them fail, letting them die. So in the acid ammonia attacks, those communities are essentially compacted. They're literally excluded. And I suppose the third point is the geography of all of this as well. Most of the middle classes do not go into these places. The geodemography of places with mold will be very, very specific. It won't be random. The geodemography of people who have acid thrown in their eyes will not be random. And they're probably in the same neighborhoods as well. The compound nature of all of these kind of material
Yeah.
impacts is massively spatialized.
Yeah, I just say totally agree. And in lots of ways, what you're saying is sort of where we began to try and think with this case and try and think what kind of languages, theories, concepts do we need that are adequate to describe those conditions. So the necro is one that Bev in particular has been developing in her work. But it's trying to, I guess, I think more elementally was what we sort of where we arrived at a bit was, it's about the sites of struggle now are about elemental infrastructures and resources in a context of state capital nexus where states captured and penetrated by multinational corporations, etc., and financialization, etc. And we found that little bit of writing that does exist on kind of thinking, including yours, thinking through asset class struggle in particular, and around the elemental, and what would like real interdisciplinary work look like in this space. A bit like Celia said in the chat about how do you do the work on inhaled smoke. You need to kind of work at the level from the genetic through to the big structural in this work, and kind of have adequate vocabularies, not only for conceptualizing it, but thinking about how struggle's taking place in this context. And I think that's one of the things we've been trying to grapple with is kind of de-silo the research in a way that because I think that's one of the barriers that we have.
There's some excellent work over here in Australia, out of Adelaide, by Amy Clare and Emma Baker, on epigenetics and the role of housing within that. I think it's a paper in the BMJ, but using the British Household Panel Survey and the biomarkers on that. And they show that the longer you live in the private rented sector, even more so than social housing, it has an impact upon life expectancy, and the aging process is more profound than smoking and alcohol. So to try and reframe these issues around demography and epidemiology, I think is, without making it technical. I mean, I think the thing is that the politics of all of this is so difficult because it's so grim and it's so dark and it's so difficult for people to get their heads around. It's not an attractive kind of topic, is it? But how can we think about trying to, I'm just thinking in terms of sort of, the power of popular cultural representations of this phenomena. I'm just thinking about, Kathy, what was it? Kathy Come Home, which is the one that everyone points to in the 60s. But I guess like the post office dispute, or over here the recent documentaries about robo-debt and all of those other sorts of things, that somehow to try and put it into people's everyday lives. And maybe we should be working with soap opera writers or something, to think about the struggle over mold in someone's bed, to make it a real issue somehow, just to get it on the agenda in a way that otherwise it just becomes a kind of a technical matter. But there's something there as well, I suppose, about just kind of changing atmospheres of poverty. The smells, the noises, the disregard. the rubbish, the mold, all of those things, even I guess the glitter. In a sense that I can imagine the mold and the glitter and the acid all coming together within many of the places that we've studied in terms of those material impacts, in terms of the sorts of traces, the sorts of new urban geographies of atmosphere and effect that's manifest through that material.
Also, though, it's about the inability to escape that I find the
Yeah.
most worrying.
Mm.
Once you've got materials in your lungs, you can't get rid of them.
Mm.
We can't escape from these things, yet we're not letting them happen. We can't stop them happening. So I think we've got to think very carefully about how we direct these politics. And I do think the work of that sounds great. The epigenetics people is really good, because we ended up looking at loads of BMJ articles. So kind of thinking about how our bodies really, really do work. And coming from that kind of feminist history was very interesting. But I think it's the compound nature and where do you target? So I think with any good struggle, you work out where can you target? And local governments are much different to the state as in the national government. So I think there are places and there are people, amazingly in the Northwest, I think, working on really difficult things and trying, again, lots of medics trying to do things for health workers. So it's really hard, but you do need to do the identification.
The politics for me is really interesting in the sense of the class politics and the individualization that we experience. I mean, in Australia, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's something now you have to earn something like $120,000, $130,000 a year to be able to rent in Sydney affordably, which that means spending less than 30% of your wage on rent. I think that the mean wage at the moment is about $78,000, so that's nearly double to be able to do that affordably. Yet, so there's people in the middle classes, professional middle classes now, that are experiencing all this kind of very obvious class-based kind of cost of living crisis, up into the people that are earning kind of quite good money now. It's becoming increasingly impossible for them to kind of cover basic stuff as well. Yet would never think of themselves sharing problems with people living in council flats or housing. We're starting to kind of experience similar money-based problems. So there's something about the political nature of that that's kind of missing in terms of the solution that I think it's easy for someone like me to point out, but like quite difficult to come up with a solution for, I think. And I think Imogen's early work on status and the revolving subjects still speaks a lot in terms of why there's that divide that happens within people that increasingly have connections that kind of ignore each other or often don't like each other or don't want to be around each other.
This has all been digitized as well. I mean, we've been doing work on digital risk profiling in terms of access to private renting, social housing, and to mortgage futures. That recent book by Foucault and Healy on the ordinal society, they have this notion of what they call the Lumpen-Scoritariat. I think they call but those people who through the accumulation of digital traces are ordered and ranked in terms of the access that they can get to the different tenures. And one of the shocking things, and we haven't written up as a paper, but there's a very long empirical report on this, is that social housing providers in the UK are using this technology as affordability criteria to give people access or not to give people access to social housing. And social housing had a function to provide housing for people in need. But now, if they don't reach certain kind of affordability criteria, they're sent to the lower end of the private rented sector with all the mould and all the other sorts of obligations. So it's being kind of digitized and riskified in terms of access to all of this phenomena. And the only hope I see there is that in a sense that does give a certain commonality. I mean, we've just written a paper called Precarity in Common, which is looking at the way in which people in often very different circumstances are all ranked similarly by these technologies. So they suddenly have the same kind of risk profile as other people. And I think as people get more and more aware of the advent of things like open banking and of these digital risk profiling technologies, there might be some kind of collective movement there, I suppose, in terms of using that around a kind of a surveillance technology and a kind of a way of apportioning access. Anyway, it's a different matter, but the point I'm trying to make is that in a sense, layering on all of this is a whole bunch of new algorithmic technologies that are actually now kind of commodifying these kind of patterns of access for a significant proportion of the population.
Okay, I think we might call it a night or a morning there for those in the UK. So once again, really want to thank our great array of speakers here today, Becky, Imogen, Bev, and Roger. Please look out for our other seminars. We've got I think 3 or 4 more to go this year, and I'm currently putting together an array of another 10 for next year. So I'll be sending those out. If you want to get on our mailing list, please send me an email. And again, yeah, thanks a lot to our speakers, and hopefully see you next time. Thanks.
Bye.